right, here.
All right, folks, good
We'll get it
evening.
later. We'll get it later.
Good evening.
Okay.
I want to welcome you all. As we do these days, we must say before we begin the official program tonight that we're in the 116th day and 13th hour of our captives being in darkness. We pray for their immediate release unconditionally. And we pray for those on the front lines and our family in mourning. We're with them as they are in Shiva and in Shloshim. We pray, Yeshalom, Ba'aravet L'chol Yoshveh, that there should be an ultimate peace. So tonight, we come together with that kind of strength and connectivity to Am Yisrael in our little corner of the world at OZ.Lucy2024.Plevan, dedicated as we are to learning. And this lecture, this lecture, is because Lucy is a member of our synagogue, our community, and also a foundational scholar in Jewish studies. She was born in 1915 and died in 1990. And her book awards were for the war against the Jews, which she lifted and brought into focus. And then Holocaust studies became what they are today, in many ways through her foundational work. And she also won the 1990 National Book Award for a memoir. And she was instrumental in being able to share a personal side of who she was as a human being, as a Jewish soul, and as someone who really integrated academia and scholarship and Torah and tradition and ritual and being part of a micro community, if you will, and Am Yisrael as a people. And it's in her spirit that we continue to learn and have this lecture as part of our birthday celebration at OZ.Lucy2024. Happy 35th. And I want to very much thank my partner in planning lectures here at OZ.Lucy2024, Mark Ashley, who's not with us physically tonight, but here in spirit, and sends his greetings. And I want to now just turn and say welcome to Dr. and Rabbi Bill Plevan, whom I'm so delighted to have here with us this evening. Bill, I knew him as a New York personality a few years ago. Now I guess we have to share him in Philadelphia. He had both a scholarly life as a doctor in Princeton and post that in philosophy and Jewish thought, and taught at the seminary, in addition to running adult learning, and was even part of the series here and taught a semester at OZ.Lucy2024 with our learners on Tuesday nights. What was that called at the time?
Well, it was part of Context of
Context,
right?
right.
Yeah,
It was part of Context.
Sort of a local group here. Recognize some faces.
Bill's got papers on academia.com if you want to, right? There's a few there, and I've enjoyed reading your work. As I thought about who was a teacher of Jewish thought this year, after at High Holy Days introducing the notion that here we are at 100 years of the publication Since I and Thou, I turned to Bill and I said, I'm right about that. We're all right about that Buber actually did that. Maybe there's another story. No, this is it. We looked up the publication date. We affirmed that. And I knew that the Lucy lecture should focus in on this essential book. What I'm sure you'll hear in tonight's message from Bill, from Dr. Plevan, the essential nature of this philosophy that not only Jews claim as their own, but the world really. Buber is a thinker beyond the Jewish fold. But so essential is this thinking as the impersonal nature of life really takes over sometimes. And the individualism that we face, and egoism in modernity. And Buber was thinking through these things 100 years ago in a profound way. Dr. Plevan is a faculty member now at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia, where text study and thinking about civilization is a serious endeavor for students. And I know that his students are lucky to have him, as we are this evening for this lecture.
Thank you very much.
Can I just take 1 second?
Sure.
So sorry. I'm just going to have you, I didn't bring a stand for. Well, this computer is showing the class, but I won't be able to see you.
This would be an appropriate book, Rabbi. This would be the appropriate book to.
Well,
Oh, look at that.
for those online, we're using a copy of the War Against the Jews prop up.
And if you just give me one more minute, somehow some people are having trouble getting on the Zoom. So I need to figure out how to do that while you have my phone. See Leslie there? This room's such- Oh, Jay, you did get on.
Yeah. Good.
All right, wait, two more people have asked. I'm so sorry.
I'm so glad that we've extended the library and we have everybody online who is online. And we also now see why sometimes we actually don't offer a Zoom option for those who have asked that question.
So,
Not to say we don't love having you out there in Zoom land.
so I'll just say, it's wonderful to see some familiar faces from the learning I did here. Years ago, and or from other places. Hollywood Mine, Salman's here. Really great to see you. FFC deserves special mention, of course. So it's wonderful to see you all, and it's wonderful to be with you. And I'll let Helene tell me when I start with the formal. I'd like to thank Helene and Rabbi Golden for inviting me. And
I don't know what she did. Just telling everybody and pasting this to everybody who's email. And I don't even have a link, I'm just telling you as well. Do you have batteries on your phone? That's great. I just can't monitor my email if other people have trouble.
Link to. You want me to log in?
Oh yeah, if you have batteries, you could log in
Yeah.
to it. Go to the website and click on the phone.
Okay.
And I can use my phone and actually send
So
out
it's-
an e-blast with our link.
You said it's the Talmud link?
Yeah.
Okay.
That would be great. And don't connect audio.
I know. Lots of echoes.
Should I still wait for a minute?
No, one person I just emailed got it. And I emailed two other people, so.
Email it to me. Even when you get a chance.
Let's get all the technicalities done.
You got it? Let's see.
I'm coming.
You have to say okay that it's being recorded.
No audio.
Looks like you're connected.
Okay, and
You're damn.
A lot of people are getting on it.
all right, I gotta turn off the whole second. I think I have.
Well, I got sent it work for Lori, work for Jay, work for Melissa. Okay, woman, I see you. Okay, now I will, I can't text you that. Oh, I'm gonna email you. I'm gonna read.
Let's put it back here.
So this is how people are gonna see it. It's
Look at that cute face.
I can email you this thing, but I need your email address.
Oh, okay.
You want to just type it in?
I'm gonna give you an email.
We all should remember to shut off our phones. Silence them.
And let's just have nobody call us.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, forgive me, but as long as you've not started, is it intentional that the camera's facing Charlie in the back of the room as opposed to the
Yeah.
speaker?
Yes, we just need
So,
to,
You just have to flip it, the bottom right.
Oh, as long as you know. Okay, no problem.
Oh, you know
You
what?
get
I
to see
know.
the room?
do you know what?
Yeah, I
did you
think
do?
I have it on
Yeah.
rotate.
I thought you wanted to see me, Jay.
Oh, you could
Bill
send
is,
it.
Right.
Rabbi Plevan is playing the part of Melinda Zalma tonight. No, I'm just, it still says my name.
Okay, I'm
You'll say my
sorry.
name, but it
I
is.
think Jay was waiting for Taylor.
I will mute myself again.
I mean,
Jay, is that better now?
Yeah, there we say.
it's just Bill, Rabbi
on Melinda's
Plevan
It's-
is says
it's-
Melinda.
I'm really happy to look at all my friends, but I just didn't know if you knew.
Wait,
But
now
no,
it's not working,
It's
Jay?
not facing
No, I know that we
Oh,
added
no, 'cause-
my phone,
Just-
Jay, where it says
You have-
Melinda.
You have to put it onto,
Speaker.
you have to take it off of speaker mode, you have to go to gallery mode.
Can we pin? You can pin,
Yeah.
pin.
Okay, listen.
Well, we're doing
Don't
this.
waste
We
your
got
time. I'm on gallery mode. Don't waste your time with me.
There.
There we go.
Now.
Now I see.
All right, very good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, people can see. Okay,
Yeah.
good. Wonderful. Thank you for sending that to her. She's a special friend.
Unfortunately, it just went in subject instead of, luckily it's gonna work.
Okay,
every
hopefully.
time again.
Okay, I'll start then. Okay, great. Thank you. Well, it's a real honor to be here. Of course, part in part just because knowing what a wonderful, this is a much younger congregation than I thought, actually, but
She just brought the meeting down by a lot.
yeah. Okay. So, but what a wonderful and serious community this is about Jewish learning, and to be a part of this community for, especially to celebrate its birthday, which I'm very happy to be a part of, and to honor the life of Lucy Davidovich with this lecture, and her life and work. I'll mention, actually, I told why am I blanking on her name? Nancy, who wrote Nancy Sinkoff, who wrote the biography. I ran into Nancy Sinkoff. I said, I'm doing the Lucy Davidovich lecture. Right? Nancy Sinkoff of Rutgers University wrote a significant biography of Chambers. I'm sure that's why I figured people might know it. And she said, well, it's funny to talk about Martin Buber and Davidovich together because they have very little sort of in common, sort of culturally and politically. But I did think about a connection between the two of them that I think is actually quite significant. Because in addition to the war against the Jews, for which, and her work on the Holocaust, that she's most famous for, she also edited a book, which I think came out in 1967, called The Golden Tradition. And The Golden Tradition was an anthology of the Jewish cultural life of Eastern Europe. One of the things I'm going to be doing tonight is talking about the relationship between Buber's thought, or the role of Hasidism in Buber's thought. And really what put Buber on the map as a Jewish thinker was his scholarship of Hasidism. There were several things that put him on the map as a scholar and thinker, which I'll say more about. But perhaps the thing he was sort of most well known for as a young, significant Jewish intellectual in the early part of the 20th century was his work on Hasidism. And I think there's a very sort of meaningful and powerful connection between the work that Lucy Davidovich was doing in this book, The Golden Tradition, by anthologizing the literature and the spiritual life of Eastern European Jewry. Of course, when Davidovich was doing this in the 60s, this was in the shadow of the loss of the Holocaust, right? In a sense, the meaning and the power behind that work was a sense that that world of Eastern European Jewry really had been lost. It had been destroyed by the Nazis during World War II and as a result of the Holocaust. When Buber engaged in this project, in his project of anthologizing and translating Hasidic stories, which is really, he was one of the first scholars, along with another scholar named Hillel Zeitlin, who's worth mentioning in this context, but they were really the first scholars to translate Hasidic stories, which were mostly in mixtures of Hebrew and Yiddish, into a Western language, in this case German, and bring it to a broader audience. And Buber's purpose in doing this wasn't because the community had been destroyed. It was still thriving under a great deal of threat of both economic deprivation and, of course, violence and anti-Semitism. But for the most part, it was still a thriving, living community when Buber was alive. But the reason he wanted to bring these stories to a broader audience was because he had a sense that those stories, that wisdom, and that spiritual tradition had been neglected by Jews and had been, in the ways in which Jewish life and Jewish spirituality had been neglected and dismissed by the Western society and Christianity, by the Western world more broadly. And so while the context may be quite different, I think we can see why Davidovich's project and Buber's project really go beautifully hand in hand to recognize both the sense of loss that comes from the material, social, and unfortunately actual death of human beings and the destruction of a society, but also the ways in which we have to acknowledge that at times Jews and Western societies more broadly neglect the greatest spiritual and ethical wisdom available to us. So it's in that spirit that I present to you some of Buber's teachings with a particular focus on the relationship between his ideas about dialogue, which I'll explain what that means, and the Hasidic tradition. Because I think what Buber was trying to teach, and Rabbi Bolton really articulated it very beautifully, was the power of human relationships and the possibility for a kind of intimacy in human relationships that build not only meaningful interpersonal relationships, but also build meaningful communities and build a meaningful relationship with God. And to use the terminology of classical Jewish sources and the Hasidic tradition, to bring God into the world. So the title of the talk, I have sort of variations of these teachings that I do, and sometimes the titles are a little bit different. So tonight I called it God in the Everyday. How do we find God in everyday life? But this can sound almost like a simple childish question. But for Buber, it's actually that simplicity and that childlike nature of that question that makes it quite profound, that makes it so profound for him. And this is really what he sees in the Hasidic stories, was, in fact, which could easily be dismissed as magical, mystical, childish, superstitious, as actually quite profound in their teaching. And actually something that the Western world, with this emphasis on technology and control of nature and building societies with large abstract institutions that fail sometimes to really meet human beings' actual spiritual needs, that Hasidism and the Jewish tradition, broadly understood, could provide such valuable resources to address the spiritual needs and at times the spiritual emptiness of life in Western societies. So as Rabbi Bolton mentioned, Buber later became importantly well known. I should say, let me say a word of introduction about Buber, that he was born in 1878, just for some sense of context. And his first foray into the translation and publication of Hasidic texts began around 1905. He started working on it in earnest, and so around the time of 1909 to 1913, he was publishing essays and translations that were translating them to German and publishing them, and that became enormously significant. He was blessed with many years. He lived till 1965, and so he was able to continue publishing and writing essays. And of course, one of the blessings of being a great thinker is also that you get to change your mind about something in a very important and profound way. And I'll say a little bit more about this, but the most important and significant product of a change of heart and a change of mind that Buber had in his midlife period was the publication of this work I and Thou, which is now celebrating its 100th anniversary. And it was this work that also then sort of put Buber, as it were, on the map as a major thinker about philosophy and religion. He was already well known as a public intellectual in Germany. He was sort of one of those go-to people when Christians wanted to engage in dialogue with Jews, and he was the person that Christians would turn to be in productive, meaningful, peaceful dialogue with Jewish thinkers. But Ayin Now also really cemented his legacy as a major thinker. The thing about this book, Ayin Now, is that it's very beautiful, it's quite profound, and it is very, very difficult to understand. So I have tried and found various ways of teaching it. And what I've done here, both as method, but also to give you a sense of Buber's thought, is to pair critical passages from the book Ayin Now with Hasidic stories. And I will tell you the Hasidic stories are a lot more accessible. But also I think because it really does convey what Buber was trying to achieve in different ways. Buber was he was a writer. You think philosophers you think of as writing a certain kind of way. He doesn't usually write in the way that philosophers typically write. He does write that way at various points, but he was also a beautiful writer, and at times a poet, at times a lecturer, at times an essayist. And so in Ayin Now in particular, he was trying to capture a poetic sensibility. And also wrote in a way that was often very oblique. We know that he's referring to certain kinds of thinkers, and if you're familiar with those thinkers, you can say, oh, he's referring to so-and-so, but if you're not familiar with those thinkers, you wouldn't really be sure, and it's hard to sometimes follow the conversation. And it's, I think, not insignificant that he never really tried to write a book quite like that again, which I think he understood that the book was very, had a great impact and was very profound, but he needed to find different ways of expressing himself. But one of the significant ways that he found to express himself was through these translations of Hasidic stories. Yeah.
Was the book written in German?
Yes.
Does that make a big difference?
Yes. I think it's fair to say that there's a certain acceptance for impenetrable writing among German authors. That it's not just a feature of the English language, it's really also the ethos of American writers very often, is to really avoid that in certain circumstances. Certain American writers anyway wish to be more public and accessible, even as they were writing books.
Just a quickie, could you provide some context around what was the nature of the Jewish community pre-World War I in Deutschland? What was it like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I'll it really fits in to what I'm saying about Buber, is that there were different types of Jewish communities in Germany in the period both before and after World War I, but there were many Jews who had been completely, well, I would say completely, but there were many Jews who were disaffected from Jewish life. So there were many Orthodox communities of the sort of modern Orthodoxy approach that we're used to thinking of as modern Orthodoxy today. But there were also many Jewish communities that were very committed to a form of Jewish liberalism, but that at times felt very empty in a spiritual way to people. And I think particularly at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century into the post-World War I, the Weimar period, there were many, not only Jews, but spiritual seekers of sorts, right? Don't think the 1960s exactly, though I think there are some parallels there, but people seeking greater spiritual and humanistic connection through literature, through art, through idealistic social projects, and Buber was sort of a part of this milieu, not just Jewishly, but I think a lot of Jews were attracted to this, to these movements as well. And so I think that was so Buber really that's how he found an audience, not only among Jews, for this kind of writing. So I'll relate to you two stories that I think help us understand Buber's life and Buber's thought. And then we'll go into some of the text here. The first story these are both stories that Buber told about himself, I should say, that he wrote about. They're both certainly true stories, but they're also stories that Buber, I think, Buber himself was a storyteller about his own life. And I think that what was important about those stories was not just that they were biographical, but they were an attempt to teach something that he learned through a personal experience, through a personal encounter. The first is that Buber, as a young child, Buber's mother left the family. I mean, she really abandoned the family. It wasn't just that his parents separated and divorced. She went away. She went off and lived with somebody else and was not a part of his life from the time he was 2 years old. And it was only a couple of years later that he tells this very powerful story about a young babysitter, like a middle school or teenage child, who said to him very directly, "Your mother is never coming back." And Buber himself would say that many years later he did have an opportunity to meet his mother, but there was no real encounter between them. It was impossible for him to kind of start up the relationship again. There was really nothing for them to say to each other. And Buber would later refer to this kind of meeting as a mismeeting. That is, it wasn't a real encounter. It was an encounter that involved having no encounter at all. The other story, but I should say, as a result of what happened in his family, at a very young age, he went to live with his grandparents. So he was born in Vienna, but his grandparents and his father had been raised further in Lemberg or Lvov in Ukraine, and so Buber lived kind of further east and sort of went away from the big city of Vienna, which was really kind of in the heart of Central Europe, and sort of Central European modernity, and lived in a different kind of city in Eastern Europe. And it was there that he encountered Hasidism. His father was a traditional but very modern-oriented scholar of Judaism, also a very successful farm owner and businessman. But his grandfather was a great scholar in his own right. And so while his family wasn't Hasidic, his grandfather would occasionally take him to these Hasidic communities. And Buber would later remember this as he began to seek the depths of Jewish teachings later on. The other story I'll tell that Buber himself told is a story about a young man who was a soldier during World War I. So the story is supposed to take place around 1916, I believe. And this man came to him, and Buber describes himself as being very taken up in mystical contemplation at the time. Buber studied a great deal of mysticism in his early adult literary career. And this man came to him and sort of interrupted him, and Buber sort of took the meeting and had a conversation with him. And this young man was trying to ask him a question. And Buber perhaps was more impatient than he should have been in trying to answer this man's question. And they talked for a while, and eventually the man went away. And Buber found out later the man died, and in fact that he had taken his life. He was as a soldier contemplating having to go back to the front in World War I. The circumstances of it personally are not known to us. Buber didn't really relate that. But Buber would use this story as a way of telling how he had changed his thinking, and that Buber himself realized that the mystical experience, that is a very private, individual type of experience, was lacking in a kind of ethical core. And it really led him to change the way he was thinking about things. Now, we know from Buber's biography that there were many things that went into Buber changing his point of view around the time of 1916, including appreciating the horrors of World War I itself. But it was this change of heart and change of mind that led Buber to think about Jewish spirituality as an interpersonal experience rather than as a mystical experience. And this is what led him to writing this work, I Am Man. And one thing I'll point out about these two stories is to notice that one story is very much situated in family life, and the other is situated in an encounter with someone who is essentially a stranger to him. And so I think it's helpful to understand that when Buber is talking about encounters with others, that he means this as something that can be situated in the types of communities or families that we normally think of as being more organic, right? You're raised in a family, you live in a local community, you have say a synagogue community, right? Where you participate and you get to know people in an organic way over a long period of time. But that it's also possible to have a profound personal encounter with someone that you've never met before. I think sometimes people make the mistake of thinking that Buber's philosophy is just a way of telling you, oh, you should go out and have random conversations with people and feel very spiritual in doing so. He did feel like you could do that. But what was important for him as well was the idea that those kinds of encounters would remind us of the possibility of having meaningful human connections with people who are around us all the time. And that's what he meant by community, right? So you could find community in different sorts of places. And the problems of modern society very often take shape in the fact that, when you think about it, right, if you live in a big city, as I think all live nearby here, right? You all live in a big city, you encounter many, many, many more people than if you lived in a small village. But how many of those people do you have a real sense of community with? And I think that was the challenge, the spiritual challenge that Buber was, I think, getting us to try to think of. Okay, now let's look at some text. What I've done is I've taken, the book I Am Now is divided into 3 parts. And I've taken a quotation from each of those parts, and then I've given you a couple of Hasidic stories. We're not going to look at every single text in here. First of all, I want to get through the 3 parts. But roughly speaking, the first part is about interpersonal encounters. The second part is about community, and the third part is about God and religion. I'm going to focus on the God part. I can say more about religion as a general term or a concept. But one of the things that's important is to say that the trajectory of the book is to get to God, right? So, but what he does in part 1 and part 2 is he doesn't really talk about God. So it might be possible to think that coming away from part 1 and part 2, that God is sort of on the sidelines of those conversations. I don't think that's quite the case, and I'll show you a passage where I'm going to say that I think it's quite clear that he's always building up towards the encounter with God, and we'll see how he understands that. But what's important is to recognize that he's trying to walk you through step by step a way of thinking about life and relationships, and how God comes into the world through our interpersonal relationships.
Yeah, just to say a technical note, to those online, you can go to the event page on our website, and the link to the source sheet is there.
Great. Hope everyone has the sheet in front of them. Would someone volunteer to read? Or are they going to be able to hear?
Yes.
Okay, the people on Zoom will be here.
I'll read the first.
Okay, so only read up to where it's number 50, the page number 53 for now. Let's going to start with, this is the very beginning of I Am Now. I'm just going to read that first half of that paragraph. Go ahead.
The world is twofold for man in accordance with his twofold attitude. The attitude of man is twofold in accordance with the 2 basic words he can speak. The basic words are not single words, but word pairs. One basic word is the word pair I, you. The other basic word is the word pair I, it. But this basic word is not changed when he or she takes the place of it.
Okay. So we're going to stop there. Now, first of all, so the book is famously titled I and Thou. The word thou was the first English translation. In German, it's du, which is considered the more familiar form. So there was sort of a debate among translators. I'm basing this on the next English translation, which was done by Walter Kaufmann of Princeton University, who said that it was better to use the English word you, but he still titled it I and Thou, because that was this is the right. He still titled it I and Thou because that was the more well-known, here we go. That was the more well-known title of the book, okay? Buber uses this phrase, basic words. And he says there are two basic words. One, and that they're word pairs. One is I, you, the other is I, it. Now, what does he mean by this phrase, basic words? I'm not gonna ask you to try to figure it out. I'm just gonna tell you, and we're gonna use that as a jumping off point. I think that'll be more helpful for us. Let me say this. I don't think that Buber is doing linguistics. He's not making a claim about the way language works. And I don't think he's really making a claim of logic, right? You might, if you heard the term basic words, you might think he says, well, you have the basic words, and then out of the basic words, other words come, or something like that. I think what he's doing is he's making a claim about what human beings are like. So when he says the world is twofold for man, he's saying that human beings relate to the world in two fundamentally different ways. There are two ways that we as human beings relate to anything in the world. And it comes through in the way that we speak about things, because human beings, the way we relate to the world is structured by our language, because we're talkers and we use language to be in relationship, to understand things, to describe things, but also to relate to things, right? We don't just use language to describe things, we also use language to actually develop that relationship with other beings. So there are two modes of relating to the world. One is what he calls I, it, and the other is what he calls I, you. And when he says the thing that it doesn't matter if it's he or she, right? What he's saying is, don't think of it as just the third person kind of neutral word it. It's any time that we're speaking about any other type of being or person as an other, in that kind of third person way that we talk about things, in a third person way of relating to things, that we have I, it. And so the whole book is based on the idea that we have to appreciate and understand the difference between these two ways of relating. Any questions? I'll open it up for questions.
Well, I have a small question, because English only has one word, you.
Right.
But I know in many European languages, and I don't know about German, I only know about French and Spanish. When I would speak to my husband, I would use one kind of you.
Right.
I would use like a tu.
Right.
And when I was speaking to you, I would say you or usted in Spanish. And
Right.
Does that come into this?
Yeah, so that's the like it's often it's called like familiar or
Right.
unfamiliar, right?
Or,
so the German is the same thing, and this is he's using the familiar in the word familiar. But this is why I say it's important that he's not doing linguistics. He knows about different kinds of languages. He knows that some languages have that feature, other languages don't have that feature. So he is, I think, trying to convey what he means by the you is something that's more familiar. But he's not making a claim about what languages are like. He's saying sometimes we relate to others in that familiar sort of way.
Because you and I are both human beings.
Right.
That kind of thing, as opposed to,
Right.
I mean,
That's right.
I remember, because I did in high school, that's what I learned.
Right.
In college, it was such a long time. If you used the familiar the wrong way, it was almost insulting.
Right, that's right.
Not so much
That's right.
today, but back then.
Right, right. But again, and I think again, what's important here is he's not really talking about how we use words. He's talking about any words that we might use and how do we relate to each other. Do I relate to somebody as a fellow human being? Do I have community with somebody? As opposed to treating somebody as an object, as a stranger, as somebody that I might, something I might work with or work, I might even, it's like if I go to the store and I buy something from somebody, I'm paying them the money, right? I'm doing justly by them, but that's not the same thing as treating them as a fellow human being or being in community with them. So let's, if you wouldn't mind reading the next paragraph. And then this is where the poetry begins in this book. Yeah.
When I confront a human being as my you and speak the basic word I you to him, then he is nothing.
He is no thing among things. Yes, it's not nothing, it's no thing.
No thing among things, nor does he consist of things. Neighborless and seamless, he is you and fills the firmament. Not as if there were nothing but he, but everything else lives in his light.
Okay, yeah, let's just stop there. So again, in an I-it way of relating, a person is a thing to me. Now, that doesn't have to be evil inherently, right? But when someone is my you, by the way, it doesn't have to be a person. It can be other types of objects or other types of beings that exist. It could be a cat, or an animal that you love, right? Then I'm not treating them as a thing. And then notice he says neighborless and seamless. So what he means is when I'm treating another as a you, I'm not thinking about them as just one of many things. There's no neighbor, right? It's just this person, just this cat, if you will, right? And seamless, meaning it's not the parts of them that matter, it's the whole person that matters. That's what he means by seamless, right? That's actually, by the way, also taken from a Hasidic story, which I didn't bring here. And fills the firmament, right? I'm not really saying this is the only person that exists, but everything I'm doing, everything that I'm focused on in that moment, right, is about what's going on with this person. Now, by the way, Huber doesn't say that you can live like this all the time, right? But he does think that we can be this way at times. And the problems with modern society is that we forget to act this way. We forget how to be this way. And then let's read the last paragraph, and then I'll get some questions after that. Yeah.
The basic word I you can be spoken only with one's whole being. The concentration and fusion into a whole being can never be accomplished by me, can never be accomplished without me. I require you to become. Becoming I say you.
So
all actual life is encounter.
Yes. So there are two things I want to point out then about this language, right? It can never be accomplished by me, but it can never be accomplished without me. That is, I have to really be in it. I can't be passive, but I also can't do it myself. It requires mutuality. The other person has to respond also. I can't have an I-you relation without the other responding in some way. There has to be give back. Huber sometimes uses the word reciprocity, but what he really means is a kind of back and forth. Like we think of reciprocity as like give and take or like quid pro quo. That's not what he means, right? He means the back and forth, engagement. Both sides of the dialogue have to be engaged in the relation, right? And that, he said, all real life is encounter. Oh, so the other thing is I require you to become. That is, I can't be my full self unless an other person engages with me. I can give of myself, but another person has to receive. Right? There's no giving without receiving, in a sense. And that's, for him, real life. What he means, all real life is encounter. The fullness of life is experienced in that kind of encounter. You had your hand up. There's a question.
Yeah, actually, because I was going to refer to the beginnings, that first phrase, when I refer to it as my you.
Right.
There's a certain ownership now. I own myself, and I'm now owning you in a sense that you become important to me. It's a connection.
Yeah. I mean, I think because of the way ownership gets used, he would want to stay away from that particular idiom, but in the sense of connectedness, right? For sure, right? that there's a sense of, I think the other thing we could say here is uniqueness. That is, there's a sort of a uniqueness to this encounter between us, and a uniqueness to this moment. Every moment, Buber would say in other places, that every moment is unique. And the question is, do we appreciate the uniqueness of this moment and the uniqueness of the possibility of the distinct person in front of us, right? Because part of what makes, like, I mean, you know, people change, but you know, how much am I going to change from today to tomorrow? But what changes, I mean, Buber does think about people growing, right? But what makes it possible for me to grow and change is also appreciating the people who are in front of me, the life that's in front of me, that's different at any moment. What I encounter today is going to be different than what I encounter tomorrow, and who I encounter tomorrow. Yeah, definitely.
Would it be possible that Buber, if you were to say I, it, you, what are examples of it would be, you would be what the Tanakh tries to say, which I'm not sure which you'll understand, of God's relationship with Moshe as opposed to God's interaction with other things, that the differentiation was that Moshe was the true Ayu, whereas the other ones were the Panim Panim, whereas God's interaction with others were the I, it.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, let me take a couple questions actually. Let me see what the questions are and I'll come back. Yeah.
I was wondering what the philosophical influences are for this, because I think of Judaism as being a klal and being a minyan and being more than two-ness, that
Right.
here is one.
Right.
I think of yin and yang as being very symbiotic. So I'm wondering if this is only Jewish influence or thought, or what were the kinds of things that went into this?
Right. Okay. Good. Yeah. And then let me take another couple questions, and I'll sort of bring it together. Yeah.
My question might complement this question. I wasn't seeing it through a religious lens, but I could potentially see this as a psychological thing. I could see it as sociologic, as in groupings of people. How much are they on the IU versus the I-it continuum, and might read it spiritually.
Right.
So I don't know what the intent is.
Right. Okay. I'll say something about it.
Bobby's question sparked is something that struck me about the turning into becomes the firmament, and everything else lives in his light. That especially that everything else lives in his light seems very godly, and so it connects to the in our I thou and I you relationship. We're bringing out the divine within the other.
Yeah. Okay. So the general thing about Buber, he's in conversation with psychology, sociology, social theory, religious thought, and spirituality. He's in conversation with all of those things. Probably the most important Western philosophical influence on Buber early in his career was Nietzsche. But he turns away, he turns from Nietzsche into a more ethical direction. And there's a kind of, he's also reading Kierkegaard very seriously in terms of the relationship between the human and the divine. But he's also very influenced by a variety of social thinkers who are kind of loosely influenced by Kant, by Immanuel Kant. What they're getting from Kant is the idea of the interpersonal. It's a very different philosophy than Kant, if you're familiar with Kant, but the idea of the interpersonal comes from Kant. Okay, so that's some of the philosophical influence. But as we'll see, he's trying to bring out Jewish teachings into this. So this is what I said about the book, because the book builds. It builds in the direction of God, but it also builds in the direction of community. So this section of the book is not about community. Section 2 of the book is about community. So here he wants to talk about the interpersonal. It's not to the exclusion of the community, it's the building block of community, as we'll see. We'll see that in a little bit. So look, I mean, the thing I would say, setting aside the issue of specific biblical texts, is that Buber thinks of IU relations as things that all of us, in fact, do have, and but episodically and occasionally, right? So it's not that like this is an IU relationship and this is. It's not like you have different tags in your people. Well, you all know what a Rolodex is, right? So. It's not as if you have tags in your contact list that say, well, these are my IU relationships and these are my IIT relationships. You know, you live with someone else, a roommate, a spouse, right? Someone's got to take out the garbage, right? You rely on that person, someone's got to take out the garbage and pay the bills. Like, that's an IIT dimension to any relationship, right? The people that we're closest to, that we love the most, there's always going to be an IIT dimension to that relationship. I'm getting this from somewhere else in Google too, right? But not exactly about the garbage, but you know, but it's the possibility of the IU that yes, so the great spiritual personalities exemplify the possibility of IU, but in human relationships as well as in relationships with God. So this is what we see from the stories of the great Hasidic teachers, and Buber talks about it also in the context of the Bible and biblical prayer, right? He wrote, I think, like 5 or 6 books on the Hebrew Bible, so he writes about the prophets primarily. So that could be, if you want to have me back, we could do several sessions on that. But so what he's looking for from great religious personalities is that sensitivity to the IU dynamic. But we don't achieve it all the time. Let's read a Hasidic story, shall we? Okay, someone else volunteer to read. Now, yeah, we're gonna find a volunteer and then I'll just do a quick setup of the story. Yeah, are they gonna be able to hear him online if he moves from back there?
I'll raise my voice.
All right, okay. Okay, so let me just, before you start, one of the features of some of these Hasidic stories is rabbis or Jews who end up in these sort of like these pubs or inns. Inns were not like nice hotels. They were kind of rough and tumble places with sort of a rough crowd. And you'll very often hear, and when they say peasants, that means non-Jewish peasants. Now, sometimes the cultural stereotypes around the non-Jewish peasant was not exactly positive, right? These were sort of rough characters, you have to imagine, right? So this is like Roadhouse Bar kind of, you have to imagine, would be maybe our sort of contemporary framing for this, right? With all of the, all the problems there, right? Okay, so this is Rabbi Sasov, who's a Hasidic Rebbe, who's gonna say what he learned about love between human beings from 2 peasants they were drinking, right? It says they were drinking, so they're at a pub or an inn or something like that. Please, go ahead.
How to love men is something I learned from a peasant. He was sitting in an inn along with other peasants drinking. For a long time, he was as silent as all the rest. But when he was moved by the wine, he asked one of the men seated beside him, "Tell me, do you love me or don't you love me?" The other replied, "I love you very much." But the first peasant replied, "You say that you love me, but you do not know what I need. If you really loved me, you would know." The other had not a word to say to this, and the peasant who had put the question fell silent again. But I understood. To know the need of men and to hear the burden of their sorrow, that is the true love of men.
What do you think of this story?
I can't help but go to the psychology of someone who lost his mother and never had one. And it seems that the UI, who makes you feel like an I in the first place? It's the mom. That makes the person a person. And the first you is the mom. And what is a mom supposed to do? To know what I need and to take care of me. So it's, so I think it goes back to his childhood.
Yeah. No, yeah. Who tends to talk about it all goes back to your childhood?
Well, Freud.
Yeah.
Freud was more 20s, 30s, 40s, but it's Freudian, and there was a lot of the symbolic things going on in the early 1900s in art and the mysticism. And I wonder if he met Freud.
I don't think he met Freud. And Freud, I think, I mean, he's very much in conversation with Freud. It's really later on, and I think he is very aware of the kind of Freudian analysis, and he's Buber, I think, is very explicit himself. I mean, listen, Buber, I think, had a certain amount of modesty. He didn't talk about himself all the time, but I think he understood what Freud might say about his relationship with his mother, and I think he understands himself as to be offering like a different way of thinking about it, right? That is, yes, the lost relationship with his mother is a very profound influence on his life, and it was something that sparked this longing and these kinds of meditations. But yes, I think it's beautiful to sort of make this connection between what Buber sees here in this Hasidic story with his own experience, right? His own story, right? It's his own personal spiritual story. So I mean, first of all, just to appreciate, like, there's a certain amount of comedy in the story, right? The rabbi's telling the story and depicting a very sort of common scene of two drunk men in an inn who say the types of things that you would only say when inebriated, right? And sort of the truth comes out momentarily, right? And then the Rebbe kind of brings it home and says, actually, there's this very ordinary thing that happened between these two men who were inebriated. It's actually there's a profound spiritual truth in this very ordinary moment, right? It is very characteristic of the Hasidic stories, right? Something that a child says, something that an unlearned person says, and often something that happened in a pub between two Gentile peasants, right, while inebriated.
No, I was thinking, it's really so much what Bobby Kohler just said. I mean, Judaism is such a communal religion, and you can't even say a prayer if you don't have a minyan. Where in Catholicism, which is the only other religion I know a little bit about, it's you and the priest. I mean, I can talk to Rabbi Bolton, and it's maybe a little spiritual, but it's not the same as when I'm with the community. And that, it's funny, I just started to read a new book that just came out, I think it's by Alter, about Amos Oz. His mother at 12 when he was 12, committed suicide. That's even worse than losing a mother. Or the same, I guess. But it's really interesting that these two great Jews had the same experience. But I really think Buber could only be Jewish. That's all I can say. I mean, that's my tagline.
Well, let's talk about community then, right? Let's turn the page then to the next page. And now, so if the interpersonal relationship, if what's fundamental in the interpersonal relationship is our capacity to know what the other needs, right? To hear their burden, to understand their sorrow, right? Again, this is a very challenging way to live. Buber doesn't think we can live this way all the time. But he does think that this is the essence of the building block of being in community. What's a minyan for, after all?
And when someone dies, I have to go to the shiva, whether I knew them well or not. I mean, if they're part of my community, that's where I was last night. We had a death in the community and we go. Where Christianity doesn't have that same, they go to a viewing, but they don't go the same way that we do when we have a death. And so we have a death. It's not someone had a death, it's we had a death.
Can I get a volunteer to read the top of page 2?
I'll read.
Okay, go ahead, thank you.
True community does not come into being because people have feelings for each other, though that is required too, but rather on 2 accounts. All of them have to stand in a living, reciprocal relationship to a single center, and they have to stand in the living, reciprocal relationship to one another. A community is built upon a living, reciprocal relationship but the builder is the living, active center.
So there are three things here that I want to comment on, right? One is he makes this comment about feeling. So what Buber means by feeling is really emotion understood as an internal psychological state. I have an emotion within me. I have a feeling. I can feel anger, I can feel love, I can feel hate, I can feel hunger, right? He thinks of these as internal states. So he said, I have a feeling towards you. That's something going on inside me, within me. So you might theorize, so here, this is one of these passages where he's really engaging social theory and psychology. Right? We talked about this before. So you might think that what makes a community, a real community or a thriving community or a strong community, is that each of the individual people have a feeling within them towards other people. And what he's saying is, it's not the feeling within me as much as it is the dynamic between us. Something going on between us. Now he does say, right, the feelings are required too, because he understands that human beings need to have those feelings, right? Emotions serve us as guides to the way we relate to others, right? But we need something more than just the feeling within us. We need the actual dynamic between us, right? There's no giving, right? I'm saying like, there's no giving without receiving, right? Yeah.
Wouldn't there need to be a sense of trust that I can relate to you?
Yes.
Not feeling, because I know that, or I feel, or I have a sense that it's reciprocal in that.
Yeah, so I mean, to take sort of contemporary parlance, right? Like if I have the capacity to trust, I'm gonna feel safe with somebody, right? If I don't feel safe with somebody, I'm not gonna be able to trust. But I think he would say that yes, the feeling of safety is a prerequisite, but it's not what actually makes the relationship happen, right? That's a precondition. It's an essential condition, but it's not the actual relationship itself. The actual relationship itself is something that goes on between people in the community, not just between two people, but between a multitude of people. Right? So then we have these other two things, right? He says you need the reciprocal relationship and you need the center. Okay, so the question, the center is the new thing here, right? The reciprocal relationship is what we got from part 1 of the book. Now we're in part 2 of the book. What does he mean by the center? And that's something we'll talk about now.
I was wondering what he would think of a kibbutz, because I don't know if a kibbutz has a center, because the center sounds like a human, actually, the builder that is also living, active center, and I'm not quite sure how healthy that is to make a community because of a person in the middle. And I'm not sure what he means by that.
Okay, this is a good question. I'm gonna take some questions about this and then we'll bring them together. Yeah, one, yeah.
So I see the center, I don't think has to be a person or even a leader. The center could be your communal commitment to a religion or to a sports team. Or to a rock star. I think they all have the potential to have that same structure of a relationship with something, but then building out that relationship as you begin to interact with others who share that same interaction with the center.
Right. Okay, good. So we're thinking here about what is the center and how does it work, right? So we got some ideas on the table. Back there, yeah.
I just wanted to say the same thing. The center doesn't have to be a person. It could be an ethos. It could be a set of principles. It could be a belief.
Right. Ethos or a set of principles, right? Okay. It could be the center, yeah.
So what happens when, like, you have, especially Hasidim with the Rebbe, the central figure was like a cult figure.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Any other? Okay. So this is a great question. And I think this comes up a lot in the interpretation of Buber, is what does he mean exactly by the center? And could it be a person, because he does talk about it as a leader, and could he be talking about, say, a Hasidic teacher, a Hasidic Rebbe, but sometimes that figure becomes like a cult figure, right? So I tend to think that he doesn't actually mean a human being or a person. He does write a lot about leadership in his other writings. but I don't think he necessarily means that the center is a particular leader. It's certainly not a leader in the sense of a static person, because that would be cultish and a form of idolatry. And based on the sort of the things he says about idolatry in other places, I think it's quite clear that he doesn't mean that here. And I think now remember what I said about the book, right? The book builds part 1, part 2, and part 3. And part 3 is about God. And in part 2, he's staying away from explicitly theological language. So I do think that by the center, he's actually gesturing at something that transcends any particular person or any particular static entity. So talking about ethos and values, I think, is actually much closer, because he is thinking about, and he is thinking in sort of religious terms. That is, the thing that the community is about is something that transcends any particular individual person in the community, that is serving as a guide for what we're about beyond my particular needs or desires. So, I mean, you mentioned sports and music, right? Okay, so I would say, I would push that and say, it's not the team that's the center, it's why do you play the sport? What's the good that comes out of playing sports? What's the good out of playing music, right? It's not, right? The boss isn't the boss, right? It's not the rock star himself or herself. It's why you play the music. Whatever it is that you think, right? There's some value that transcends any particular musical figure, right? And I think that's the kind of thing he's going for. But ultimately, to give away the game, right? I think the center is God. Now, what does he mean by God, right? His conception of God is quite flexible, as we see, right? That is, he is rooting himself in the classical images of God that come from the Jewish tradition, but he's not restricting his idea of God to whatever is in the Bible or in the classical midrash, right? He's very, I would say, ecumenical, to borrow a good Christian term. It's very ecumenical about how people understand God. That doesn't mean he thinks anything goes, right? But he thinks that different ways that we talk about God can be the builder of community. And that's where so when he thinks about the distinctiveness of Jewish life, right, he's saying, we Jews have our own language for talking about God and for talking about how we live with each other, how we conduct ourselves in interpersonal relationships, and how we think about our history. All of that is distinctive of who we are as Jews. Other communities will do the same thing, right? They have their distinctive language for talking about God. They have their distinctive ways of talking about their interpersonal relationships, etc. Right? He actually thinks that Judaism has something very profound and distinct and unique to teach the world about religion. But that doesn't mean that Judaism is superior to other religions for him. That's not quite the way he thinks of it. Yeah. What was the other question?
No, I mean, what I would say, I mean, I'm just going to comment that, I mean, if you're getting to where spirituality is from, believing in a higher being.
Yeah.
That's what I get. I understand that. And it depends what you define your own higher being.
Right. Well, so, and I think, again, what I would point out, right, is, again, I want to make this comment about the way the book builds from section to section. So at this point of the book, he wants to talk about the way in which God is the builder of community. There's much more to God than that. But he wants to talk about the way human societies work at this point. He's not talking about God in the fullness of the way we use God language at this point in the book. So you have to kind of, when you get to part 3 and he talks about God, you have to plug it back into everything that he said before. I think that's the way to read the book. Let's read one of these Hasidic stories on page 2. Someone else want to volunteer to read? Let's use this one in the image, Rabbi Raphael. Yeah, go ahead, please, yeah.
Rabbi Raphael asked his teacher, "Why is no face like any other?" Rabbi Pinchas replied, "Because man is created in the image of God. Every human being sucks the living strength of God from one another place, and all together they make up man. That is why their faces all differ from one another."
So this gets to this question of, right, the relationship between his understanding of interpersonal relationships and God and the divine, right? Each person is connected to the divine in a different way, right? And this is a kind of mystical way of understanding, or I would say a mythical way of understanding why human beings all look different, right? But it presents this very profound teaching, right, that each one of us represents the image of the divine, or reflects the image of the divine in a slightly different way. But what emerges from that is the idea of all of the images of God are needed. And that's the ethos of community. The ethos of community is that every person is valued. The ethos of community is that every person, remember going back to the peasants, right? To know their needs. If we really knew the needs of each person, and we could really respond to the needs of each person, that would be real community. And the flip side is that every person has something to give. Every person has something to contribute. And that's community. If you wouldn't mind reading the next one, it's just 2 lines. Rabbi Pinchas again teaches us something.
Rabbi Pinchas said, "When a man is singing and cannot lift his voice, and another comes and sings with him, another who can lift his voice, then the first will be able to lift his voice too."
I want to ask you to tell me which person you are in shul, but I'm guessing you've seen this happen. Every person, right? There are ways in which we give each other strength in building community. And so lifting each other's voice, it's a thing that really happens, right? But it's also becomes a metaphor, an image for what we do when we're building community. Sometimes we're the one lifting up the voice of the other. Sometimes we're the one in need of our voice being lifted up. And remember, right, Buber's interest in language here, that, right, that to talk about language is the way in which we express ourselves in relation to others, right? That it's through language that we relate to others. So the lifting of the voice, I think, becomes a very beautiful way of thinking about how we become connected to others in community. All right, so let's move on to part 3. These other stories are beautiful. We don't have time for all of them. If you're particularly interested in Talmudic commercial regulations, the story of love of neighbor on the bottom of page 2 is a good one. And if you want to ask me about it later, come to me later or email me. If you're not, don't worry about it. But yeah, so now we get to part 3 of the book. And here we understand God's role in this story about relations, human relations, and reciprocal relations, right? I-thou relations. This comes, the first couple of lines come from the very beginning of part 3, and then there's 2 lines that come from later in book 3. Does someone want to volunteer to read?
Sure.
Yeah, please, Rabbi. Yeah, and just go through, read all of those 5 lines there.
Extended, the lines of relationship intersect in the eternal you. Every single you is a glimpse of that. Through every single you, the basic word addresses the eternal you. Man can do justice to the relation to God that has been given to him only by actualizing God in the world in accordance with his ability and measure of each day.
So if we think back to the story of the teaching of Rabbi Pinchas about human beings being in the image of God, right? All of these relations, all of these relatings that we engage in the world, again, whether it's to human beings or to other beings, all of them open up a window, open a doorway, as it were, to a relationship with the divine. God is present in potential in all relations that we engage in. Now, if you think about some biblical teachings, right, you think about what does it mean to say that human beings are created in the image of God. One of the things that emerges from this in a lot of Jewish thinking is the idea that it's human beings who bring God into the world. This becomes the organizing point of the Torah, is the construction of the tabernacle. We're going to read about this in 2 weeks, right? But actually, if you think about it, this coming week is Parsha Yitro, where we receive the 10 Commandments. If you think about what happens at Mount Sinai, right? Mount Sinai becomes this holy place, and the community is gathered together. And in gathering together, the community creates a space in which God can come into the world, right? And the tabernacle that they build in the desert later on, the Mishkan, right, becomes a structure around which they can build community, right? It becomes a structure around which that can be a focal point for bringing God into the world. But Buber's teaching is that the real essence of Judaism isn't the building, it's not the structure, it's not the it's not the ritual of it, it's the human relationships, right? Remember what he says about community, right? The living reciprocal relationship between them and their common relationship to the center. So if you understand the center as God now, right, it's through that relationship with God that we maintain our life as a community. So what he's doing in book 3 is now teaching us how to understand what our God language is about. Our God language, Buber is arguing, is about the way in which our relations, these moments of relation, these moments of encounter that we have, it could be with a family member, a spouse, a friend. It could be with someone we've never met before, a stranger, an otherwise stranger. But all of those relations, all of those encounters become a way of encountering God in the world. And like I said, right, we can have these encounters with strangers, as it were, but the idea is not to just go out and say, well, I met a stranger and I had a profound encounter with them, boom, that's it, and I'm going to go do another one tomorrow. It's to have a sense of community as a vehicle, an ongoing set of relations with people with whom I'm in community, with whom whose needs I can truly understand in an ongoing basis, and bring God into the world through those relations.
I'm a bit confused, and I always have been with Buber. Does this really have to be a religious thing? Isn't it just the fact that there's interpersonal love, caring, trust, support? I mean, God is a way of explaining why a community of people, rather than just two people, you know, two partners or a parent and a child. But where does the religion come in here? I've always wondered that.
So can I, if you will allow me, I'll interpret the word religion to mean what we often call organized religion, or ritual, structure, and the like. Not established, but organized religious community. So Buber had very little use for Buber had very little use for ritual. Actually, oh, you asked me about the kibbutz. Buber actually was a great proponent of the kibbutz. He was actually another way he became sort of a leader and something of a literary sensation among European Jews was for advocating for young idealistic Jews to go on Aliyah and create these idealistic communities. And he writes very passionately about the kibbutz as a project. So what we think in our contemporary parlance and what becomes Israeli parlance around different types of Jews in Israel, right, is we think of the kibbutz as a very secular thing, except there are religious kibbutzim that are Orthodox, right, religious, right? But what Buber was trying to do is to take this kind of idealistic enthusiasm and marry it to what I would call a neo-Hasidic spirituality that didn't really take off, right? In other words, you can still find some kibbutznikim. There aren't that many kibbutzim really in the old style anyway, right? But there were kibbutzim that kind of tried to take, or kibbutznikim as individuals who sort of try to take Buber's teaching, right? What Buber was really trying to say is you can have a relationship with God separate from the formal structure of religion. So how do you do that?
Well, where does the faith? So I didn't even mean organized religion.
Right.
I meant the faith.
Yeah, so I think the way that Buber thinks about religious faith is, so I mean, F brought up the example of like Moses before, right? And I said, my answer to that was right, that Buber thinks that we can learn from great religious personalities about God. So I think for Buber, the power and the essence of Jewish education, let's say just Jewish education, right, would be to study these great texts, to study the Bible, to study stories in the Talmud that talk about rabbis in prayer, and to study Hasidic stories of Hasidic rabbis. And through that, we would come to understand how to encounter these moments in different ways, right? The way in which you read poetry or study art, the way that, I'll take an example, the way that Monet teaches you to see a sunset, or that Van Gogh teaches you to look at flowers, right? That's not ritual, right? That's you engage in sort of a kind of spiritual learning, and then it allows you to experience something in everyday life in a different sort of way. And I think that's the way he thought about religion and faith. And what religious traditions provide, what the Bible and the Talmud and Midrash and Hasidic teachings, what that provides is that vocabulary. It's that distinctive religious vocabulary, which is, again, I want to go back to this point about the book, right? He only is really talking about that in part 3 of the book. In part 1 of the book, he wants to give you a vocabulary about relationships. In part 2, he wants to give you a vocabulary about community and societies. And in part 3, he wants to give you a way of understanding the vocabulary about God. And he's saying, you can have this vocabulary about God without having ritual, basically. I didn't give those passages, but that's what he argues in the part of it. Yeah.
And it seems to me that he's also saying, well, it's almost a guidebook for those who are questioning God, who don't know how to connect to God. So if you're starting, we can connect with each other. Okay, I got that makes sense to me. Okay, connect with community. Sometimes I don't know if I need to connect with community, right? And then, well, why do I need to connect with God? Well, once you're already connected with community, extend. You can connect with God. So that first line there is that I could see it building that way and speaking to that type of seeker or someone who's got that questioning of God.
I think that's right. I think that's right as a way of understanding what he thinks he's trying to do with the book. Whether it worked or not, I'm not sure. But right, the idea is I can bring people in, right? He's holding the God part off because he knows that for the people who are looking for deeper spiritual connection in the 19 teens and 20s are very often turned off by classical theological language, right? The more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
According to the German expression. Okay. Thank you. You're paying attention. Okay.
Right. So I just trying to respond to the question. I also focused on that first line. Extended the lines of relationship intersect in the eternal you.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm misinterpreting that, but that certainly sounds to me like all of the I-thou relationships sum up to actually having a spiritual center, which is the religious part of this.
So here's what Buber says about people who don't believe in God. He's one line about this in the book, in I Am Now. And I think, but it's doing a lot of work. And he has other passages where he has other of his stories about himself where he talks about people he encountered who say, I don't believe in God, right? I think what he says is, he says in the book, he says, God is the most burdened of words, right? Because people hear God and they have these very challenging associations with authority, with distance, with judgment. And he says, but you know, sometimes the people who say they believe in God, right, don't do justice to what God really is, because they're not really living in relation. And even a person who refuses to use the word God, in their most profound moments of relating to another, they are also relating to God. Now, that sounds weird sometimes, right? Because, you know, when you say someone, you tap someone on the street, say, like, oh no, you really do believe in God, right? It's actually quite offensive, or it's, you know, it's a little bit, you know, patronizing, right? But I think what he's trying to say, right, is it's really in this kind of what I'm calling his ecumenical moment, right? Is to say that what he says in another part of the book is, right, all the words for God. If I had had more time, right, all the words for God are holy or sacred. I forget which word he uses. Right, when he means it, all the names for God. Right, all the names for God are hallowed. That's the way it's translated. All the names of God are hallowed. Right, and what he says is, you know, all of these different societies, cultures, religions, they have different ways of talking about God. And they all fall into kind of disuse, or they all become degenerated, right? They all become weighted with problems in various ways. So sometimes we can renew them. And that's really what he wants to do with Judaism. He wants to find a way for us to renew our capacity to speak with the language of the Bible and the Midrash and Hasidic literature, to talk about God in the way that they did and to learn from them. Right? But he also recognizes that we may need new language for God. And he also recognizes that it's the most burdened of words, and that sometimes that's a challenge for people. And so what he wants to point out is that, you know, the words, it's not that the words mean nothing, and it's not that they're arbitrary, but we have to understand that the words are powerful insofar as they actually become a vehicle for a relationship, a real relationship with God, which cannot be to the exclusion, and this is the key point, the relationship with God can't be to the exclusion of our relations with others, with beings in the world, right? So I'm gonna take us to the end here and read these last two stories.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Do we have any insight into how this was written? Any work through this? Was it 1, 2, 3? Was it?
You mean, did he write it in order?
Yeah. Do we have any insight?
You know, he delivered a set of lectures a couple of years prior and kind of was drafting it. So I think he did. Yeah, I mean, these weren't like separate works, right? I think he had a plan to have this kind of unfold in his work. So one of Buber's favorite Hasidic teachers is the Kotzker Rebbe. So this is this famous teaching. This is the sort of slightly longer version of it. Where is the dwelling of God? This was the question that the Rabbi of Kotzk surprised a number of learned men who happened to be visiting. And they laughed at him. What a thing to say. Is not the whole world full of God's glory? Right? Melo chol haaretz kavodo, right? Is a verse from Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 6. And then he answered his own, it's not Haftarah this week. Okay, if I'm not mistaken. Then he answered his own question. God dwells wherever man lets God. So if you plug in this statement of the Kotzker, which Buber loved to quote this in others of his writings, you connect this with his teaching about relationships, right? It's through relations with others that we bring God into the world. Okay, one more Hasidic story. You know what the Misnagdim are, right? The opponents of the Hasidim, right? Yeah. Traditional, rigorous Talmudic study and punctilious observance of halacha, right? The Hasidim were less into Talmudic learning, though some Hasidic groups became more so. and observant of halacha for sure, right? Those that kept kosher, Shabbat traditionally, but maybe just a little bit more loose about how they would do certain things, as you'll hear. And this misnaged comes to the Rishner Rav, and he complains, and he says basically the nature of the complaint is, they call you Hasidim, which means you're the pious ones, but you daven late, you don't daven in time, you don't get up early enough for davening, and then after davening, instead of what we do is we learn Mishnah, and you guys drink. You drink schnapps, basically, right? So he said, these misnagdim came to Sanag, to the Rav of the Rishner, when he was passing through their city, right? So he's going around through Europe, through Eastern Europe. In our congregations, we pray at dawn, and after that, we sit wrapped in our prayer shawls with phylacteries, right, with tefillin on our head and arm, and we learn a chapter of the Mishnah. Not so the Hasidim. They pray after the hour set for prayer has passed, like later than the Mishnah teaches you should be davening. And when they have finished praying, they sit down and sit down together and drink schnapps. And yet they are called devout. They're the Hasidim, and we're called the adversaries, misnagdim, right? Now, in the story, there's an ellipsis here because the Rebbe had like a jokester in his court, and the jokester kind of gives a different kind of answer. I left that to the side. It's sort of funny. I'm not sure that the joke really lands today. I didn't totally understand it myself, but the rabbi says, so the truth of the matter is this, right? He's going to give a more profound response to the misnagdim. Ever since the day of our temple was destroyed, we pray instead of making sacrifice. And just as sacrifice was disqualified if thought was impure, so it is with prayer. So the evil urge devises ruse upon ruse, right? The evil urge is kind of here mythologized as trying to trick people, right? To confuse one who prays with thoughts alien to prayer. Now, the Hasidim have invented a counter ruse, right? A countermeasure, if you will. After praying, they sit down together and drink to one another, l'chaim, to life. And each tells the other what is burdening their heart. And when they say to one another, may God grant your desire. And since our sages say prayer can be said in any language whatsoever, this speaking and answering of theirs while drinking is also regarded as prayer. But the evil urge sees all that they're doing is eating and drinking and using everyday speech, and so stops bothering his head about it. So, right, to me, this is the Kiddush story. You've davened for several, however long you daven here, right? 2.5 hours maybe. You sit together at Kiddush and you say, how you doing? What's going on in your life? And you share something about what's burdening you or what you're hopeful about. And you say, I hope things go well with you, right? May God grant your desire. Ken Yehi Ratzon, something like that, right? Hope all goes well with you. And that becomes the prayer. That becomes what God hears. May God lift up the thing that you desire. Right? That's what you're supposed to be doing during davening, is praying for what you want, right? Lifting up your desires. Instead, right, just in case the Yetzer Hara, just in case the evil urge gets to us and makes our thoughts impure, while we've really maybe a little tipsy, or we've eaten something good and we're had a little sugar high or something. The evil urge isn't paying much attention, and in spontaneity and genuineness, we respond to each other. I hope what you need in life, I hope what's burdening you, or I hope what you're hopeful for goes the way you want. And that becomes the prayer that God hears. And that's how we bring God into the world, through community, through relationship, and finding God through those relationships. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to entertain questions, but we've gone on a long way, so.
Wonderful. Wonderful studying this book with you in a way that brings you the focus Martin Buber's great 2-volume set of Hasidic stories for folks who want to be inspired by those good old Hasidic stories, or puzzled by the jokes the rabbis tell, as you alluded to, or the way that a spirituality of its time landed amidst the Jewish conversation. Those books are a lot more accessible than I know. If you're really a nature lover, you'll see that the relation is, you also alluded to, he uses one chapter and talks about a tree becoming really deeply entwined with the natural world around us. And that this notion of standing as trees in a forest really speaks, and you'll see ripples of his thought in Heschel in that vein, and the phenomenology that's going around in Germany at the time, and this beautiful notion of part of the wondrous, as opposed to having to deal with a Kantian kind of ethic, a norm of interpersonal, always, did I do right, did I do wrong by this other individual, that I'm striving to create this moment of encounter. And it's within that encounter that we pray that we are really making and developing community. And we made that happen only because you brought us into the deep forest of Iron Mountain, which is not easy to, and you've made it quite accessible. And I think successfully here for this lecture. It's a hallmark of this community to toast our birthday and to say that we'll continue this pursuit of learning as a community. I want to, before we get champagne, invite everyone to, in that regard, to think about joining this table on Wednesday nights for Talmudic discussion. Thursday mornings, we're reading deeply Heschel this year, in addition to looking at liturgy, 8:40 a.m. on Thursdays. This is the kind of conversation we have. On Shabbat, of course, we have wonderful Torah dialogues. This Sabbath, I'll be looking at the mountains of, or plains of Midian with Yitro, as you mentioned, it's part of, to the mountains of Salt Lake City and the Mormon Tabernacle, where I spent some time. Frida Bornas will celebrate becoming bat mitzvah, learned to lane the 10 Commandments. Very proud of her for that. And having the Kahal here to celebrate this young woman. If you're at services, she'll be doing the beginning and end of her very long haftarah, and I'll be pinch hitting in the middle, because she committed to learn the Kriya for the 10 Commandments, do it so that we could stand and really experience Sinai. It's generation to generation. I think Chaviva is the youngest ever to attend a Lucy lecture. So,
she heard her name. She heard her name.
If Diane is still online, Diane Okert, Mazel Tov, a year of health and goodness. Your birthday is today, yes?
Mazel Tov.
Mazel
Happy
Tov.
Happy birthday.
And what a nice way to celebrate an Orzu birthday too.
Thank you. I wish I could be there in person, but this was the next best thing. And thank you, Rabbi Plevan. It was really a pleasure to learn with you, really.
Wonderful. So let's get some champagne, and we're going to make a toast and have some cake. Check off.
Years ago.
Okay, we can leave.